Hey guys, welcome to Franklin Woodworks. No, this is not a boom box attached to my workbench. It's one of the projects on my to-do list, a Moxon Vise. I've had one on my bench already that used pipe clamps, and the vise worked great. But the downside was that I had to be able to reach the back of the vise to access the pipe clamps. So the entire width of the vise needed to be accessible in order for me to use it. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but in my small shop, I'd have to move my assembly table in order to be able to access the pipe clamp in the middle of my bench. To be honest, because of the trouble I had to go to, I just didn't use the vise. So I'm going to do something about it. The only things I needed to buy for this project was 2 scaffolding leveling jacks, 2 cast iron hand wheels, and 2 lengths of 5/8 inch threaded rod. The scaffolding jacks are going to be my screws for the vise, so I have to cut off the foot and cut the screw to the length I need. Since the screw is hollow, I'm going to use the length of 5/8 threaded rod to hold the entire screw assembly together. I'll have to make spacers to go in each end of the screw to keep the threaded rod centered. So after I measure the interior dimension of the screw, I turn a piece of walnut on the lathe to the appropriate thickness, bore it out to accept the threaded rod, and cut the piece into 4 smaller pieces. Next, I have to turn the hub that will allow me to join the screw to the hand wheel and mount that assembly onto the outer jaw of the vise. I turn this out of oak, and after laying out the measurements for each section, I turn both hubs at once, leaving a tenon in the middle, and then I cut the 2 sides apart. Now I can use the tenon to remount each hub, bore out where the screw will fit into the hub, then bore a 5/8 hole through the entire hub to accept the threaded rod. Then I turn the hub around, remove the tenon, and create a recess that will accept the hand wheel. In the middle of each hub is a groove that will hold the locking ring that will lock the mechanism onto the jaw. Then I create the locking ring. So after milling down a piece of oak to the thickness of the groove in the hub, I bore out the center where the hub will go and cut the pieces in half at the bandsaw. Also bore out the hand wheels so they will also accept the threaded rod. To put the screw assembly together, I tap in the spacers on each end of the screw, mix up some epoxy to put inside the hub and on the screw, being careful not to get any epoxy near the hole where the threaded rod will go. After putting everything together in the right order, I cinch it down with washers and nuts on each end of the rod while I wait for the epoxy to set. For the jaws of the vise, I milled up some live edge hickory, stuck both jaws together with double stick tape to make sure the holes lined up as I bored out what I thought was the right size hole for the screw assembly to go through. Since I couldn't go all the way through both jaws due to the short length of the Forstner bit I was using, I went down as far as I could, separated the jaws, and finished the hole on the bottom jaw. Turns out I got my Forstner bits mixed up and drilled the smaller of the 2 sizes. This was bad. So to fix it, I had to get the jaws back into the right spot using the smaller Forstner bit as a guide, clamp the jaw into place, change out the Forstner bit, and drill the correct size hole. Then I had to repeat this process 4 times. But on the inner jaw, I only had to bore the bigger hole a little bit of the way through. I don't know what you call them, but for lack of a better word, the giant wing nuts that the screw goes through have to be recessed on the back side of the inner jaw. So I just trace around the nuts, get out the router, and freehand the recess. This part doesn't need to be pretty since it will be hidden from view. I cut the majority of the wings of the nuts off, leaving just enough to put a screw through to tie them into the inner jaw. Now I have to create small recesses in the workbench itself to accept the part of the wing nut that isn't entirely recessed. I drill holes in what is left of the wings and attach the wing nuts to the jaw. some pre-drilled holes in the jaw for mounting to the bench, and some 3-inch screws mount the inner jaw to the bench. I attach the mounting rings after inserting the screw assembly in the outer jaw and begin the tedious process of screwing the whole thing together. Tedious because I had to take the washer and the nut off the threaded rod so I could start the screw through the wing nut, so I couldn't use the hand wheels to speed this up. Once the screws were in far enough, I could put the washers and nuts back on the threaded rod. Once I got everything tightened up, the vise moved surprisingly smooth. One reason I wanted heavy cast iron wheels was to give the screw assemblies momentum as I adjusted them. I think it turned out pretty good. One thing I anticipated but hoped I wouldn't have to do, I ended up having to do anyway. Because of the geometry of the vise, if you put a board in the vise that doesn't go all the way through to the bottom, the jaws will want to rack. This isn't really a problem when it comes to holding power, but it does put a strain on the retaining rings that are made up of relatively thin wood. So to fix this problem, I made a homemade wood tap, tapped a hole in the bottom portion of the front jaw, making sure that it's below the screw assemblies. Then I epoxied a knob onto the appropriate size screw so I can use that adjustment to keep the jaws from racking. I intentionally left the jaws a little proud of the workbench surface so I could plane it flush, but I'll have to get to that later. So for less than $60, I got a really beefy Moxon vise that is really easy to use. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Sharing is an awfully kind thing to do, and kind comments are always appreciated. Hope this gives you some ideas for your shop. Thanks for watching, and there you go.